Okay, let's dive in. You've provided some really interesting source material on Ronald Reagan, a president who, well, really defined an era.
That's right. We have some standard historical takes, biographical stuff, but also sources, particularly one that raise some deeper questions about what might have been going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly. So today we're going to unpack that. We'll look at the familiar story, the great communicator, his impact, but we'll also look at these shadows the sources hint at.
The goal is really to sift through all this material you've given us, juxtapose the known narrative with these persistent questions, and help you pull out the key insights.
To get beyond just the surface level understanding of Reagan and his time.
Right, because the sources together show this figure credited with, restoring confidence, big economic shifts, playing a key role in ending the Cold War. That's the common picture.
Uh-huh.
But then you dig into this material, especially source one, and it suggests, well, maybe that story isn't quite complete. It hints at hidden operations, maybe ideological battles, unseen costs that weren't always obvious.
So we'll navigate both sides, the celebrated story and these, let's say, less visible parts.
Exactly.
Okay, so where do we start? Let's look at how that public image, the crafted narrative, as one source puts it, was built. Right from the beginning, Hollywood to the White House.
It's such an unconventional path, isn't it, compared to most presidents? Source 2 gives us the timeline. Born in Illinois, went to Eureka College during the Depression.
Played football, did some drama.
Right. And his first job wasn't law or business. He was a radio sports announcer in the Midwest.
Covering baseball games, it's hard to picture going from that to, well, leading the free world decades later.
Quite a leap. And then, of course, Hollywood. All the sources mention this. He gets a screen test in '37, signs with Warner Brothers.
And makes, what, 53 films over about 20 years?
Yeah, and not just small parts. He was in some pretty major films. King's Row, that famous line, "Where's the rest of me?"
Which he later used for his autobiography title.
Uh-huh. And Newt Rockney, All-American, playing George Gipp, the Gipper.
So this Hollywood period, it wasn't just about acting, was it? The sources really stress this.
No, it was crucial training, communication training. He learned how to connect, how to deliver a line, how to project a certain persona on camera to millions.
Skills that are, well, pretty useful in politics, especially if you want to be the great communicator.
Absolutely foundational. He mastered the medium. And the transition to politics, it wasn't sudden. The sources show these stepping stones.
Right, like becoming president of the Screen Actors Guild.
Yes, SAG president, 47 to 52, then again briefly in 59-60. And the sources note this is where he apparently fought communism in the film industry.
A key part of his shift towards conservatism.
Definitely. And then came the GE role, hosting General Electric Theater from 54 to 62.
Which wasn't just hosting a TV show.
No, it involved touring GE plants all over the country, giving speeches, talking to employees, local groups, refining that conservative message, honing his public speaking outside of acting.
He was basically road testing his political platform for years.
You could say that. It gave him a national profile as a conservative voice, separate from Hollywood. And that directly led to running for office.
Governor of California in '66. Beat the incumbent, Pat Brown.
Served 2 terms, re-elected in '70. Gained that executive experience running what was then the country's most populous state.
Okay, so that's the standard progression, laid out pretty clearly in sources 2 and 3. Talented guy, seized opportunities, moved into politics.
Right.
But then source 1 throws this curveball. It asks, was this just a natural progression? Or, and this is a fascinating phrase, had he been cast in a greater role, meticulously prepared for a presidency?
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Was there some kind of cultivation happening? Source 1 speculates about influence from, quote, powerful ideological forces or even secret societies.
Suggesting maybe they saw his potential, his communication skills, and kind of groomed him.
It pushes you to look beyond just the resume, the films, the speeches, the governorship, and consider if there were other factors, maybe unseen networks, guiding his rise with a specific goal in mind.
So you have the facts from sources 2 and 3, the what happened, and source 1 asking why and how it happened like that, suggesting maybe there were hidden hands involved.
Which is always a question in political history, isn't it?
Yeah.
How much is individual drive, how much is circumstance, and how much is, well, the influence of organized groups pushing a certain agenda.
Especially with someone like Reagan, who had this incredible ability to connect and made such a dramatic ideological shift. Source 1 invites that question. Was it all organic, or was it partly facilitated?
It definitely adds a layer of intrigue to his ascent.
Okay, so he builds this profile, serves as governor, But getting to the White House wasn't easy. Let's talk about the path to power nationally.
Right, his first serious attempt was actually in 1976. Source 2 notes he came really close, narrowly missed taking the Republican nomination away from President Ford.
Challenging an incumbent president in his own party that showed his strength within the conservative movement even then.
Absolutely. It signaled he was a major force, even if he didn't win that time.
And the backdrop for 1980, when he did win, is crucial. The sources paint a picture of, well, national unease.
Big time. The late 70s, you had stagflation, that nasty mix of high inflation and high unemployment. People were feeling it, prices soaring, job insecurity. And internationally, it felt precarious too. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in late 79.
And the Iran hostage crisis. American diplomats held for over a year. That was on the news every night, a symbol of perceived American weakness.
Right, so there was this widespread frustration, a real hunger for change.
And Reagan tapped into that. He won the Republican primaries in 1980, beating rivals like George H.W. Bush,
who then became his running mate.
Right. But the general election against Carter wasn't a slam dunk initially. Source 2 says they were running pretty close for most of the fall.
Yeah, because even though people wanted change, the sources mentioned voters were also a bit nervous about Reagan. His lack of foreign policy experience, his very strong anti-Soviet rhetoric.
Some saw him as maybe too confrontational, too much of a hawk.
Exactly. Potentially lacking the diplomatic touch.
So what changed? The sources point to one key moment.
The debate. The single debate with Carter just a week before the election. This was his chance to address those doubts directly.
And Source 2 calls it a bravura performance.
He came across as calm, confident, optimistic, relatable, not the sort of reckless figure some feared. He handled Carter's attacks well.
And then came that question.
The killer question, directed right at the viewers. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
So simple, but so powerful. It just cut through everything and hit that nerve of economic anxiety. A masterstroke of communication.
Absolutely. The sources suggest that moment really dissolved a lot of the remaining doubts. It sealed his image as capable, reassuring.
And the result? A landslide. Source 2 gives the numbers, 489 electoral votes to 49 for Carter.
Huge. It showed the country was ready for a new direction, and they trusted Reagan, largely thanks to that debate, to deliver it.
And that feeling carried him through. Re-elected in '84, another landslide against Mondale and Ferraro, carried 49 states.
Yeah, the slogan then was, bringing America back stronger, prouder, better, which really summed up that narrative of resurgence his presidency projected.
Okay, let's pivot to policy. One of the most defining and debated parts of his presidency, Reaganomics. The sources show it as, well, having two sides. Prosperity, but maybe unseen costs.
It was definitely the centerpiece of his domestic agenda. Source 2 says the goal was cutting taxes, fighting recession. Source 1 calls it, more dramatically, a revolutionary supply-side economic policy.
Supply side. The idea being if you cut taxes, especially on businesses and the wealthy, they'll invest more, produce more, and that'll boost the whole economy.
That's the theory. Stimulate the supply side rather than focusing on government spending to boost demand.
So the main tools were big tax cuts.
Huge tax cuts.
Yeah.
The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 slashed rates. Plus, a big push for deregulation across industries. Less government interference in business.
And a stated goal of cutting government spending, though that turned out to be harder.
Much harder, especially with defense spending going up. But the intended results and what supporters point to were pretty significant, according to the sources.
Hailed as the engine of prosperity, an era of unprecedented growth, soaring stock markets, lots of consumer spending.
And the economy did grow significantly after the early 80s recession. For proponents, this was proof. Supply side worked. It unleashed American capitalism.
Okay, but then there's the other side of the coin, the unseen costs. Source 2 is blunt. His dream of cutting the deficit beyond his grasp.
Right. Instead, the sources agree, deficits ballooned. The national debt skyrocketed.
Why? Tax cuts weren't offset enough by spending cuts, or growth didn't generate enough revenue.
A combination, it seems. Tax revenues did rise with growth, but not nearly enough to keep pace with spending, especially the defense buildup. So, massive annual deficits. Source 2 mentions the debt almost tripled from under $1 trillion to nearly $3 trillion during his terms.
Wow, that's a huge increase. And the sources mention another consequence.
Widening income inequality. Tax cuts disproportionately benefited top earners. Stock market gains went largely to them too, while wage growth for average workers was slower. And cuts to some social programs hit lower-income folks harder.
So this sets up the question Source 1 raises. Was Reaganomics a stroke of genius creating prosperity, or was it a risky gamble with unforeseen long-term consequences?
Yeah, like maybe a hidden burden passed to future generations through that massive debt.
It directly connects the boom times with the debt and inequality issues. Source 1 implies the full picture, the truths about its true impact, might have been obscured by the dazzling headlines of prosperity.
So you have to ask, was the growth sustainable? Who really won, who lost? And what about that debt? Are we still dealing with the consequences?
It's a debate that's definitely still alive. The sources show the boom was real, but they force you to grapple with the debt and the inequality and whether those were necessary trade-offs or fundamental flaws in the policy. Source 1 really pushes you to look past the shiny surface. Okay, let's move from domestic policy to foreign policy. The Cold War. This is arguably where Reagan's impact is seen as most profound. Globally, the sources show a sort of two-phase approach.
You could see it that way. Initially, it was about renewed strength, direct confrontation. Source 2 talks about his decision to massively expand the defense budget.
The goal wasn't subtle.
No. Source 2 says it was explicit. Show the Soviets that the United States had regained its will and forced them into serious negotiations from a position of strength. A real shift from the detente of the 70s.
And the rhetoric matched the buildup, calling the Soviet Union the evil empire.
Right, in that famous 1983 speech. That moral framing was powerful. It painted the conflict in stark good versus evil terms.
And then came SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative.
Star Wars, as it was nicknamed,
Yep.
proposed in '83. The sources describe it as this incredibly ambitious plan for a space-based missile defense system, basically shooting down Soviet missiles from space.
But Source 1 points out a lot of people thought it was pure fantasy at the time.
Yeah, science fiction. The technology needed was way beyond anything existing. Its feasibility was hugely debated.
Which leads to another intriguing question from Source 1. Was SDI just about building a shield, even if it seemed impossible? Or was it something else?
Source 1 asks if it was maybe a calculated psychological warfare campaign designed to break the Soviet Union's will.
Meaning, the goal wasn't necessarily to build it, but to make the Soviets think the U.S. could build it, and force them into an arms race they couldn't afford.
Precisely. To convince them the U.S. was launching this incredibly expensive, technologically superior race that would bankrupt them if they tried to keep up. Source 1 even wonders if this relied on hidden intelligence or secret technological breakthroughs that are still classified.
Wow. So SDI might have been less about defense and more about strategic bluffing, using technology or the idea of technology as a weapon.
It's a fascinating possibility. It suggests SDI could have been a kind of economic and psychological weapon, putting immense strain on the Soviet system, whether it was ever truly buildable or not.
It really makes you think about the different dimensions of the Cold War, not just missiles and tanks, but economics, psychology, maybe even deception.
And SDI, viewed that way, could have been a masterstroke, regardless of its technical merits.
But then, things changed. Second term, a new Soviet leader comes along, Mikhail Gorbachev.
A huge turning point. Source 2 emphasizes how Reagan, despite his earlier tough talk, developed a working partnership with Gorbachev.
They met multiple times.
5 times, according to Source 2. Big, dramatic summit meetings, Geneva 85, Reykjavik 86, Washington 87, Moscow 88. Despite major disagreements, especially over SDI, which Gorbachev hated, they built a rapport.
And they actually achieved something concrete.
Absolutely. The big one was the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in 1987. Source 2 explains this banned a whole class of nuclear missiles, ground-launched missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers.
The first time they agreed to eliminate entire categories of weapons.
Exactly. A landmark agreement. And that treaty, plus the ongoing dialogue between Reagan and Gorbachev, really thawed relations. As Source 2 says, these steps were key in easing Cold War tensions and paving the way for its end soon after Reagan left office.
So his legacy there is complex. It's the initial pressure, the buildup, the strong rhetoric, but also the willingness to engage, to negotiate, to build a relationship with Gorbachev when the opportunity arose.
Right. It wasn't just one thing. The sources show the evil empire phase, but also the crucial summitry and treaty-making phase. Both seem essential to the outcome.
Okay, so we've covered the big public policies, Reaganomics, the Cold War strategy, but the sources also point to something less visible. Source 1 calls them the shadow wars.
Yeah, this refers to the Reagan administration's use of extensive covert operations. Secret actions, basically, often aimed at fighting communism or Soviet influence around the globe.
Conducted deliberately out of the public eye.
And, crucially, as the sources note, often with little transparency or accountability.
Central America seems to be a key focus in the sources.
Yes. The administration heavily supported anti-communist groups there, financially, militarily. The most famous example mentioned in Source 2 is the Contras in Nicaragua.
Rebels fighting the Sandinista government, which the administration saw as basically a Soviet or Cuban outpost.
Right, and a major issue, which Source 1 really highlights, is that these operations often bypassed congressional oversight.
Meaning Congress didn't fully know or hadn't approved what was going on, even though Congress had passed laws like the Boland Amendments trying to limit aid to the Contras.
Exactly, which raises big questions about democratic accountability, the rule of law, the balance of power.
And Source 1 pushes further, asking, what were the true untold stories of these secret wars? Were there hidden goals, maybe illegal activities, concealed from everyone?
It suggests these actions created a moral gray area in the name of national security. Supporting groups, for instance, who might have been involved in human rights abuses. Or bending, maybe breaking, U.S. law to achieve foreign policy aims.
It really underscores that tension between public policy and secret actions. And it leads us directly to the biggest scandal of his presidency, where these shadow wars kind of blew up in public.
Iran-Contra, described in the sources as a shocking scandal. It erupted in late 85-86, a really tangled mess.
What were the basics? The sources lay out two main parts.
First, the secret sale of weapons missiles to Iran. This was happening despite an official arms embargo against Iran and the administration's very public policy of not negotiating with terrorists or states sponsoring them.
And why do it? The sources say it was leverage.
To get American hostages released. Hostages held in Lebanon by Hezbollah, a group with ties to Iran. So arms for hostages, basically.
Okay, that's part one. Controversial enough. What was part two?
Even more explosive. The money, the profits from those secret arms sales to Iran. They were illegally diverted to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua.
At the exact time, Congress had explicitly forbidden direct U.S. military aid to the Contras.
Precisely. So it linked the secret arms for hostages deal with the secret funding of the Contras, bypassing Congress completely, a major abuse of power, potentially illegal.
And Source 1 says it implicated top White House officials.
Yeah, National Security Council staff, people close to the president. It triggered huge investigations, congressional hearings, televised nationally, and Reagan appointed his own commission, the Tower Commission, to investigate.
And what did these official investigations find? Sources 2 and 3 mention this.
They found a lot of wrongdoing, mismanagement, deception, illegal acts by staff members. But crucially, the official conclusion, as stated in sources 2 and 3, was no evidence to prove that Reagan knew personally about the transactions, especially the diversion of funds to the Contras.
The official line was essentially he didn't know the specifics, he was detached, maybe poorly served by his aides.
That was the finding. But Source 1 really pushes back against accepting that at face value. It highlights the questions that lingered, asking directly, how much did President Reagan truly know?
It frames it as two possibilities, right? Was he really unaware, a detached leader? Or was he maybe a strategic orchestrator who expertly concealed his involvement?
Leaving behind this trail of questions that, as Source 1 puts it, still persist today.
So despite the official findings, Source 1 argues the question of his personal knowledge and involvement remains open, a key part of the unresolved puzzle of his presidency.
Exactly. The sources give you the official narrative of the investigation, but Source 1 makes sure you understand that for many, considerable doubt remains about what the president himself knew and authorized.
It shows how hard it can be to get the full truth when you're dealing with secret operations and plausible deniability at the highest levels.
Definitely. Leaves that space for ongoing debate and interpretation.
Beyond policy and scandal, the sources also touch on Reagan's personal challenges, things that maybe showed vulnerabilities behind that strong public image.
Well, the most dramatic, obviously, was the assassination attempt in March 1981, just 70 days into his presidency. Source 2 covers this.
Shot by John Hinckley Jr., he survived, and his recovery, the sources say, was seen as proof of his resilience.
And his attitude, right after being shot, cracking jokes with the doctors, with Nancy, really reinforced that image. Strong, unflappable, even witty under duress.
Source 2 mentions the famous line to Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck."
Classic Reagan. Humanized him, but also showed that courage.
And Source 1 connects this to the Teflon president idea, how criticism just seemed to slide off him. It mentions a later joke he supposedly made when his poll numbers dipped.
Yeah, reportedly saying something like, "I'll just get shot again," which, if true, is pretty dark humor. But it suggests maybe a shrewd awareness of how that survival story played politically, how it shielded him.
Like, even that traumatic event could be, in a way, folded into the narrative of his invincibility.
Perhaps. But the sources also mention a later, much sadder personal challenge.
Alzheimer's. Source 2 notes his diagnosis and how he shared it publicly in a letter in 1994, years after leaving office. He died in 2004.
And this later diagnosis leads Source 1 to pose a really sensitive question. Did the trauma of the shooting, or maybe the early, undetected onset of Alzheimer's, affect his judgment or decision-making while he was president in ways nobody knew?
That's a tough question. Source 1 doesn't claim proof, but suggests it's relevant to consider given the pressures of the job and the high-stakes decisions he was making.
Right. It asks what vulnerabilities were hidden behind the Teflon president image. Again, adding that layer of human complexity, fragility even, to this figure often seen just through the lens of strength.
It prompts you to think about potential unseen factors like health that could influence leadership.
Exactly. Beyond just policy debates.
Okay, so let's try to pull all these threads together. We have the unique journey, the great communicator persona, Reaganomics with its boom and its burdens, the Cold War shift from confrontation to partnership, the shadow wars, Iran-Contra's unanswered questions, the personal challenges. How did the sources sum up his legacy?
Well, they definitely portray him as iconic, an optimistic visionary, as sources 1 and 2 put it. He's credited with huge impacts. Source 2 points to the end of the Cold War, the sense of restored national morale, that long economic boom.
Though, as we've discussed with those big asterisks about debt and inequality that other sources stress.
Right. He's celebrated for that restoration of confidence, that pivotal role in ending the Cold War.
But Source 1 especially keeps emphasizing it's not a simple story of triumph. He's a figure shrouded in paradox and persistent questions.
Which brings us back to that core tension Source 1 raises. Were his triumphs achieved through unseen means? And did his hidden burdens shape the very fabric of his legacy?
It forces you to weigh the visible successes against those less visible aspects, the questions about his rise, about SDI's real purpose, the ethics of the covert ops, the doubts around Iran-Contra.
The sources mention his post-presidency too, returning to California, writing memoirs, that very moving letter about Alzheimer's from Source 2, the public final chapters.
But the overall message from synthesizing these sources seems to be, to really understand Reagan, you can't just look at the spotlight moments.
No. You have to consider the potential hidden influences, the debated long-term costs of his policies, the impact of the shadow wars, the unresolved scandals, even the potential impact of personal health.
It's about seeing the complexities, the controversies, the unanswered questions as integral parts of the story, not just footnotes. The sources really push you to look beneath that polished surface.
Absolutely. The celebrated narrative is just one part of a much more complicated picture.
So you've heard this deep dive, drawing from all the material you provided on Ronald Reagan. You've got the familiar narrative, the communicator, the economic changes, the Cold War endgame. But you've also wrestled with these tougher questions raised in the sources about hidden influences, unseen costs, secret actions, unresolved issues like Iran-Contra.
You've seen the documented facts side by side with these more probing, sometimes speculative perspectives that explicitly ask you to consider the shadows.
So, as you think about all this, here's something to mull over. How much should our final judgment of a leader's legacy depend on the methods they used? Especially, as the sources suggest, might have been the case here, when those methods involve secrecy, bypassing rules, operating in murky ethical territory. Even if those actions contributed to outcomes many celebrate, like ending the Cold War or economic growth.
Yeah, where is that line between, say, strong, effective leadership that gets results and methods that maybe cross ethical or legal boundaries?
It's a tough one.